The photograph trembled in Marcus Chen's hands as morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse suite. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from the champagne still coursing through his system from last night's charity gala, but from the impossible image staring back at him. A young woman with kind eyes stood beside a man Marcus recognized immediately, himself, 23 years ago, wearing a college sweatshirt he'd donated decades back. But Marcus had never met this woman. He'd never posed for this photo. Scrawled across the back in elegant handwriting were 4 words that made his blood run cold: "Thank you for everything." Marcus Chen hadn't built a technology empire worth $8.4 billion by believing in coincidences or sentimentality. He'd climbed from nothing, a scholarship kid who'd coded his first app in a library computer lab, to the Forbes list through calculated risks and ruthless focus. Emotions were luxuries he couldn't afford, not after his divorce 5 years ago had taught him that vulnerability only led to betrayal. Yet here he stood, barefoot in his silk pajamas, clutching a photograph that shouldn't exist and a handwritten note that had been left on his pillow sometime between 3 a.m. when he'd collapsed into bed and 7 a.m. when he'd woken alone. The previous evening had unfolded like countless others in Marcus's meticulously scheduled life. The annual Children's Hospital fundraiser at the Rosewood Hotel, where billionaires wrote checks to ease their consciences and networked over oysters and aged scotch. Marcus had committed his usual $1 million donation, delivered his expected remarks about corporate responsibility, and was preparing to leave when he'd literally collided with someone rushing through the lobby. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." The woman had dropped to her knees, frantically gathering scattered papers while trying to console a crying little boy clinging to her leg. She was younger than Marcus, mid-30s perhaps, with auburn hair escaping a messy bun and exhaustion etched into every line of her face. Her name tag read, "Volunteer Staff." "No harm done," Marcus had said automatically, bending to help retrieve what appeared to be medical bills and past due notices. He shouldn't have looked. It was invasive. But the numbers were staggering, hundreds of thousands in pediatric oncology treatments. "Come on, buddy, we're okay," she'd whispered to the boy, who couldn't have been more than 5. "We're going to be okay." But her voice cracked on the last word, betraying the lie. Something in that moment had fractured Marcus's carefully constructed armor. Maybe it was the boy's bald head, evidence of chemotherapy. Maybe it was the woman's determined smile despite tears streaming down her cheeks. Maybe it was how she'd prioritized comforting her son over her own obvious humiliation. Whatever the reason, Marcus had done something completely out of character. "I have a suite upstairs that the hotel provided," he'd heard himself say. "Room service, comfortable beds. You both look like you could use a quiet night. Please, as my apology for the collision." She'd refused 3 times. He'd insisted 4. Eventually, exhaustion had won over pride. That had been 12 hours ago. Now Marcus stood holding a mystery that made no sense. He pulled out his phone and called hotel security. "Mr. Chen, how can I help you?" The night manager answered immediately. "The woman and child I invited to use suite 2847 last night, I need to know who they were. How to reach them." A pause. "Sir, our records show that suite was never occupied. We have no registration, no room service orders, no key card access after you checked out of it at 6 p.m. Marcus's grip tightened on his phone. "That's impossible. I sent them there myself. I spoke with them." "I believe you did, sir, but our systems show nothing. I can have someone check the room if you'd like." 20 minutes later, Marcus stood in suite 2847 with the hotel manager and head of security. The room was pristine, untouched, the beds perfectly made with military precision. No evidence anyone had spent the night. But Marcus noticed something others missed: a slight depression in the sofa cushion, a faint scent of children's shampoo, and crumbs from what might have been crackers near the coffee table. Someone was here, Marcus insisted. The manager cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mr. Chen, with respect, you'd had quite a bit to drink at the gala." "I wasn't drunk. But had he been?" The evening was foggy now, details slipping away like sand through his fingers. Back in his own suite, Marcus examined the photograph more carefully. It had been taken at his college, definitely. He recognized the student union in the background. But something was off about the quality, the colors too vivid, the paper stock unusual. When he held it to the light, he noticed something he'd missed before, a small inscription in the bottom corner. A date. Today's date. But from 23 years ago. The impossibility of it made his head spin. And then he saw it, tucked behind the photograph in the envelope had been something else. A receipt. From Children's Hospital. A payment in full for one Benjamin Hayes, age 5. Leukemia treatment. $1 million. Paid anonymously at 3:47 a.m. from Marcus's foundation account. Marcus's assistant confirmed it an hour later, her voice confused over the phone. Yes, Mr. Chen, you authorized it. The digital signature is yours. But I don't have any record of you requesting the payment. It's strange, the system shows you logged in at 3:47 a.m., but you were at the gala until at least 2:30. Marcus's hands shook as pieces clicked together. The woman at the hotel, he suddenly remembered her name tag more clearly. Not volunteer staff. Sarah Hayes. And she'd mentioned her son's name. Benjamin. Ben. He spent the next 6 hours trying to find them. He called the hospital, but privacy laws prevented them from revealing patient information. He contacted the charity that had organized the gala, but no Sarah Hayes had been registered as a volunteer. He even hired a private investigator, who returned with a finding that made Marcus's blood run cold. Sarah Hayes and her son Benjamin had existed. 23 years ago, they'd been patients at Children's Hospital. Sarah had been a young single mother, barely 22, working 3 jobs to afford treatment for her son's leukemia. The hospital had a record of an anonymous donation that had saved Benjamin's life, $1 million, paid in full the day before treatment would have been discontinued. The donor, a college student named Marcus Chen, who'd somehow accessed his trust fund early and donated everything he'd had. Except Marcus had no memory of this. None. His early 20s were a blur of coding and ramen noodles and sleeping in the computer lab. He'd been broke, hadn't he? The investigator's report continued. Sarah Hayes had gone on to become a nurse. Benjamin Hayes had survived, graduated from MIT, and now ran a nonprofit providing housing for families with children in medical treatment. They'd spent their lives paying forward a kindness they'd never forgotten. Sarah Hayes had died 6 months ago. Cancer. She'd left behind letters, the investigator said, dozens of them, addressed to the man who'd saved her son but never left a name. Letters thanking him. Letters describing how that single act of impossible generosity had restored her faith in humanity during the darkest moment of her life. The investigator attached a photo of Benjamin Hayes at his mother's funeral. He was surrounded by the families his nonprofit had helped, dozens of them. In his hands, he held an old photograph, a young Marcus Chen, wearing a college sweatshirt, standing beside his mother at the hospital. An image Marcus didn't remember taking but apparently had. Marcus sat in his penthouse as sunset painted the sky orange and gold, and for the first time in years, he cried. Not from sadness, though grief for a woman he'd met only as a ghost certainly played a part. He cried because somehow, impossibly, he'd been given a gift. A reminder that the person he'd been, before the billions, before the divorce, before the walls, had been capable of breathtaking selflessness. The next morning, Marcus walked into the offices of the Benjamin Hayes Foundation with a check. Not for $1 million this time, but for $20 million. Benjamin Hayes, now a man of 28 with his mother's kind eyes, stared at the check and then at Marcus. You, Benjamin whispered. All this time, it was you. Marcus smiled, really smiled, for the first time in years. Tell me about her. Tell me about your mother. They talked for hours. Benjamin shared stories of a woman who'd turned one act of kindness into a lifetime of service, who'd never stopped believing in the goodness of strangers because a stranger had once believed in her. And Marcus realized that the real gift hadn't been the money he'd apparently given all those years ago, money he still couldn't remember donating. The real gift had been Sarah's final act, sending her spirit, or her memory, or whatever impossible force had guided her, to remind him who he'd been and who he could still choose to be. Marcus never did figure out how that night had happened or how he'd been in 2 places at once. Some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. Some were meant to transform you. The photograph stayed on his desk, a daily reminder that kindness compounds across time in ways we can never predict, that the smallest acts of humanity ripple outward in ever-widening circles, touching lives we'll never know. And every year on the anniversary of that impossible night, Marcus Chen donated another $1 million in Sarah Hayes' name, and remembered that sometimes the greatest returns on investment have nothing to do with money and everything to do with the human heart.